If you ever, for some strange reason, find yourself in a military conflict in a former Soviet republic, there's something you need to know. And that is, if you see a Kalashnikov magazine abandoned on the ground, you shouldn't pick it up, or it could be the last thing you ever do. But why? Well, basically, this is one of the most curious traps used in modern warfare. They're so simple that even a child could make them, and they're just as deadly as a grenade. They're so common in modern conflicts that, for example, in Ukraine, this type of announcement is often made. But who invented this macabre way of taking out enemies, and why, specifically, magazines? To find out its origin, we have to go back to 1955, the year the Warsaw Pact was created. After NATO members refused to allow the Soviet Union to join the military alliance, Yugoslavia would not be included in that treaty. This was a huge nation in the Balkans, made up of several ethnically distinct federations. Its leader, Josip Broz. Tito broke off relations with Stalin in 1948 as he wanted to give independence from both the West and the Soviets. Since they were not in the Warsaw Pact, the Yugoslavs did not receive Soviet weapons. However, before breaking relations, they obtained early models. From the first family of Soviet post-World War II infantry weapons, they made their own weapons very similar to the Soviet ones, but with their own Yugoslav touches. The state-owned company Zastava Arms was in charge of producing these weapons. Also, it's not that the Soviets had bad relations with the Yugoslavs, it's just that they were unhappy with their apparent need for independence. Therefore, there was some technological and logistical collaboration between both powers. For decades, hundreds of thousands of weapons, whether locally produced or of Soviet origin, were stored throughout the country. Waiting for one of the superpowers, the Soviets lost power, the majority of the Soviets. The situation revealed, I interpret that, and the most stable country? The differences between the factions were quite noticeable. And because of the fall of the Soviet Union, and also, let's say, due to some external factors, the internal factions declared war on each other in search of independence. I won't go into much detail about this conflict since it's extensive and not that relevant to the topic. But let's say that in the first 4 years of the Yugoslav wars, each federation took control of the huge weapon stockpiles that Tito had stored. To repel any Western or Soviet threat, each faction obtained weapons in an unequal but significant way, making Serbs, Croats, Bosnians and other factions basically use the same armament. And this, in the early years, created a rather curious war scenario. Each side could take weapons and ammunition captured from the enemy and use them without any problems. This, although it sounds good, is a real headache for the generals. It's something very bad strategically speaking, because that means if you were losing and retreating, the enemy would get your supplies and use them to their advantage. Meaning that the more territory they take from you, the more resources you lose and the more the enemy will have to their advantage, making it even harder to regain the initiative, and the more time passes, the harder it is to reverse this situation. This is the reason why, for example, we see that in most wars, both sides use different calibers of ammunition even though they're using very similar weapons. You can capture a lot of weapons and ammunition from the enemy, but adapting them for use in your army is more difficult. If they have a different caliber than the one you use, then you simply discard them. The Yugoslavs weren't fools, and they quickly created measures to make it harder for the enemy to use captured logistics. One of these many measures was this curious device. The first documented appearance of it was one day in early 1996. A Bosnian patrol heard explosions in a nearby warehouse. They thought it was a Serbian attack, and when they investigated, they found a bunch of fallen Bosnian soldiers in a rather grotesque scene. When analyzing what happened, they found some magazines with a strange ring on the top, something extremely unusual. One of those magazines would eventually end up in the hands of, in those years, Sergeant Bob Graver, a British officer from the Explosive Ordnance Disposal Brigade, who at that time was also working with the NATO coalition. He himself discovered that it was a simple but sophisticated explosive and would document how it worked. In fact, the diagram you see was made by him in those years. Its operation was very simple. The magazine seemed to be full of ammunition, so the target soldier, upon getting the magazine, would insert it into his weapon. When firing the first rounds, the mechanism is released, firing a striker at the explosive. It was enough to cause incapacitating injuries at a distance of 4 meters.
Si se están interiores.
The magazine had a safety pin similar to that of a grenade, which locked the safety and stuck out, indicating to the soldier that this was not a regular magazine. Once it was removed, it was impossible to tell if it was a booby-trapped magazine just by looking at it, not even by its weight, since it was similar to that of a half-full magazine. It was simply brilliant and at the same time a bit macabre. With them, every time the enemy captured ammunition, they had to check every magazine and every ammo box for explosives, limiting the enemy's ability to scavenge supplies. No soldier dared to take magazines from a fallen enemy, as it could be the last thing they ever did. Bob Graeber studied the case and found that these devices were being used en masse by the Serbs, but they were not invented by them, much less in Yugoslavia. Their origin went back to the war in Afghanistan itself, so it was an invention of the Soviets. They really weren't the inventors of this tactic in World War II either. Every time the Germans withdrew from a city or town, they left behind in the best houses a series of very elaborate traps, so varied that it was better to sleep outside. As we can see in this American document from the time, there were even some specifically aimed at officers. A very memorable one was the crooked picture frame. The Germans would leave a room spotless, except for a picture frame that they placed in a very visible spot, but crooked. By the way, the American officers, who in theory were educated and more refined people, would see the crooked picture and straighten it, and by doing this, they would trigger a mine, ending the officer's life. These traps continued to be used later in the Vietnam War by both sides and, as we mentioned, were adopted in the Soviet-Afghan War all the way to the Yugoslav conflicts, and finally in Ukraine. We see these kinds of warnings where they alert about the use of classic Soviet booby-trapped magazines, and where it explains that they should carefully inspect the magazines for anything suspicious and avoid picking them up from the ground if possible. So this tactic still prevails even today, so remember, never pick up an enemy magazine from the ground because it could be the end of you. If you like this video, you might be interested in this one about how the Soviets shot down planes with infantry rifles. Thanks for watching this one, and goodbye.